Thank you, Marianne, First Lady. It's a great privilege to be here, and I thank you for the warmth of the reception and the wonderful people who've come and thanked us for doing what we're doing. I'd like to compliment Marianne for what she's done in Australia, Asim what he's done globally. And you need to understand that they're under pressure, and they've stood up to it, and they continue to stand up to it, and it takes great courage, because we know we're doing what's important and what ultimately will be accepted as the truth. And we're here today because Iceland's going to be the first country to convert to this. Okay, so because you people eat so much fish, you're so clever. And so I had to bring my best game today. And so I apologize, I'm a biologist, and I want to show you the biology behind why we got it all wrong. And you know, Gary taught us all to question, and he presented the evidence from the history. And he's absolutely correct. And people say, you know, Gary Taubes' insulin hypothesis is wrong, but they just don't look at the history. And what I want to take you today is through the biology, because once you understand the biology, there is only one answer. And that is that we are killing ourselves through nutrition, that the chronic diseases that we see in our society are nutritional diseases. They're not chronic diseases of lifestyle. It's nutrition is number one. The lifestyle component is important. But unless you get the nutrition right, you can try everything else. And I'm a classic example, as I'll show you. So I became interested in the low-carbohydrate diet in 1972, although I didn't realize it at the time, because we were only using a low-carbohydrate diet to prove how fantastic a high-carbohydrate diet was. But we didn't realize it. So here was the first paper that we ever published in 1980 on a low-carbohydrate diet, and you see we were doing this. We would eat a low-carbohydrate diet for 3 days. We'd eat no carbohydrate whatsoever, and then we'd just eat carbohydrates, and then we'd run a marathon. And during that time, my wife said, "Your breath smells terrible when you're on this diet," you see. So my friend said, ketosis hasn't been studied more recently since about 1930. And he said, let's study post-exercise ketosis. So I said, well, if you ask my wife, it's all because we eat a low-carbohydrate diet. So we did an experiment, and these are data from myself and a friend. So we ate high carbohydrates for 2 days, where we did no exercise, or we exercised for 2 hours. And you'll now see our ketone bodies didn't change. But when we ate the low-carbohydrate diet and exercised, we got quite a marked ketosis. And that was the two of us. But what was really interesting was what it taught me about myself 40 years later when I went back to the data. So that's there, our ketones increased dramatically. Sorry, when you read the slide of this is time on the bottom, and this is the concentration. Now, Gary spoke about free fatty acids and triglycerides. Well, that's the sort of things you'd like to measure. And we measured insulin in ourselves. So here's the free fatty acid response, and here's the insulin response, which we'll get to. And remember, he said when the insulin goes down, the fatty acids can go up. And so when you're on a low-carbohydrate diet, the fatty acids are much higher than when you exercise with high carbohydrates or we didn't do any exercise. And that's because you've reduced the insulin suppression of free fatty acids. And our glucose goes up when we've eaten high carbohydrate diets and we exercise, but stays low when we don't exercise. So what really interests me when I went back to the data 40 years ago was there's something wrong with myself and my friend. We were 27-year-old each. We were both lean, running marathons, running 70 miles, 140 Ks a week minimum, racing marathons, but there was something wrong, which we didn't see because no one pointed it out. And what's wrong is that our glucose went up during exercise, which it shouldn't. These people have a problem with glucose regulation, even though they're 28. And when they eat a high carbohydrate diet, their glucose is out of control. But what's much more important, and this is probably the whole point of this whole talk, if you get this, you understand, is look at our insulin concentrations. We came into the exercise bout, we weren't exercising on that day, and our insulin was 30 or higher. These two young men have insulin resistance. And it is so bad that it doesn't even normalize by 4 p.m. at the end of the day. These two people are walking disasters. It doesn't matter that they run marathons. They are insulin resistant, and they are going to get type 2 diabetes. And that's exactly what happens. Tim Noakes and his friend have insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, despite their youth and marathon training. It improved on the high-fat diet, and they must develop type 2 diabetes with time if they continue eating a high-carbohydrate diet. And I did. I developed type 2 diabetes. I don't know if my friend, because he went to New Zealand and I haven't seen him. So what did I learn from this? Well, I learned, and I wrote this book, you see, and this book tells you must eat lots of carbohydrate because if you want to win marathons, you must run carbohydrates, etc. And I'm very proud that the book actually has been highly rated as one of the great books in running. But this is what I said. All athletes must be advised to eat high carbohydrate diets, both in training and especially before competition. This interpretation forms a central pillar of the profession of sports nutrition. That is true. Sports nutrition, they just tell you how to eat high carbohydrate diets because high carbohydrate diets are now considered ideal for both health and sport. And I apologize, that is utterly, completely wrong. And I'm fortunately rewriting that book, and I've torn out the first 4 chapters, they're gone. And you know the problem was, you see, what we did was we reduced athletic performance to one thing: how much carbohydrate was in your diet. And we forgot actually the brain's important and a few other things are important and training's important. So I restructured the book around that. And anyway, I developed type 2 diabetes as a result of that, eating this high carbohydrate diet, but also my genes. And this is a picture of myself and my father and my mother in 1981. I just graduated with an MD. And my father has metabolic syndrome. He probably has non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. He had hypertension, and he'd just been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. He died 11 years later from disseminated arterial disease. That's why I spoke so strongly about it. This is because people didn't know how to understand how to manage type 2 diabetes, and they do it wrongly. And so here I am, the genes from my father went straight to me, and I was insulin resistant at that time, but didn't realize it. And I've been strongly influenced because I saw my father die, and you do not want to die from type 2 diabetes. That is for sure. Uncontrolled type 2 diabetes. It's the worst form of death. And here's the book that my father was given to this What I Must Eat. And actually, I was a friend of the person who wrote it, and I do not blame her for one moment. She was telling us what was understood. And I haven't quoted from her book, but this is the most recent book in South Africa written on what you should be eating if you're a diabetic. So it's Carbohydrates and Diabetes. And there it says, carbohydrates are an important source of energy in the body, and glucose, which is the product of the digestion of carbohydrate, is, quote, the only energy source for the brain. That is not true. It is therefore crucial for diabetics to include carbohydrate-rich foods at each meal. So what that tells us is that when we prescribe diets for persons with type 2 diabetes, the sole consideration is that the brain requires glucose for its function. That's the only reason we prescribe. All you have to know about prescribing for diabetics. My father did not die because his brain was getting too little glucose. He died from disseminated arterial disease. And what about the effects of different types and amounts of carbohydrates on blood glucose insulin control and on the development of disseminated arterial disease that is the key pathology in diabetes? So all the management of diabetes is inappropriately based on the wrong science, looking at the wrong measurements. And so what this title should say, so it says there, for effective blood sugar control, it's important to understand that different carbohydrate-rich foods have different effects on blood sugar levels because of the difference in their glycemic index. Well, actually, that's unimportant because treating the blood glucose concentration treats only a symptom. It doesn't treat the cause, which is the disseminated arterial disease, and that's what you have to treat. And so what this should be is that for effective blood sugar control, it's important to understand that carbohydrates should be removed from the diet as they are non-essential and persons with diabetes are unable safely to metabolize carbohydrates. And then we start to sort the problem out. Because limiting carbohydrate reduces the hyperinsulinemia, which is the key driver of the disseminated arterial disease, which is a defining pathological feature of type 2 diabetes. And we have to start talking about type 2 diabetes as disseminated arterial disease, not glucose and insulin, disseminated arterial disease. So what saved my life was on 12th of December 2010. I know exactly the date. I know exactly the time. I discovered this book on the right, The New Atkins for a New You, and that opened my eyes. Within 2 hours of reading that book, I said, never another carbohydrate in my life. And it was just instantaneous. And because I was type 2 diabetic without realizing it, I benefited hugely. The rest of my life is encapsulated. We wrote this book, which became a bestseller in South Africa, broke all the records. It was astonishing. We wrote it in 5 weeks, and it just went ballistic. And we cannot explain why it did. I think the reason was because it's the first book that said, you're not the problem. If you're obese, you're not the problem. It's your food choices. And just change your food choices and you'll cure yourself. And that was the difference. Then we go, of course, fantastic recipes, etc. And then more recently, we've written a much better book, which has not sold the same way, called Raising Superheroes. It's for children. It's an astonishing book. That's, if I can advertise a book, a good book on how you should raise your children, that's it. We put a lot of effort into it. So I stole this slide from Gary Taubes, and the point I want to make is which he made and Axel made, was that the dietary guidelines changed there in 1977, and in 1978 the obesity epidemic begins in the United States, and no one will take responsibility for that. And that's the question you have to ask. Why will you not you change the guidelines, why won't you take responsibility for what happened? Why do you ignore it? Instead, why do you attack us for asking that question? So I stole this from Andreas Ehrenfeld, this lovely slide. And so it took us millions of years to get to this guy. And the point is that this guy's perfect. He's how humans are designed to be. And why is he like that? And the answer is because he's got an APPESTAT, which Gary spoke about, or he spoke about some controller which is so accurate, it has to be accurate within 21 calories a day. Well, this guy's APPESTAT has been accurate to 21 calories per day for 3 million years. That's why we look like that. You have to understand that. So any deviation from that begins with the problem of the APPESTAT, because this is a homeostatic regulated system. So the cause here is this guy's APPESTAT isn't working. Of course, as Gary said, all these other things could be involved, the fat cells and blah, 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 but ultimately the APPESTAT's failed. And to understand it, we have to understand that the APPESTAT, the homeostat, has gone, and we need to understand how that is. And the key thing is that this guy has one characteristic. He is always hungry. And if you want to understand obesity, that's it. Why are these people always hungry? And once you understand that, then we can reverse the obesity. So I just put this together, that Gary spoke about the calories in, calories out. And the point, of course, is that calories in and calories out are controlled by the brain, as he said. And we just kind of forget that, as if you can control it consciously. And that's the point. It's not consciously controlled. That was the point he was making. So the APPESTAT perhaps is there's some sort of connection between the calories in and calories out story, and that's the APPESTAT function. And this has to be accurate to 21 calories a day, as he said. And as he had indicated, if you reduce your physical activity, you don't get fat if the homeostat's working, because all you do is you simply eat less. That's how a homeostat it works. And so if you do get fat, it can't be because you've reduced your energy intake. It's because the APPESTAT's wrong. And so if their brain homeostats are working appropriately, humans who exercise less cannot become fat. They simply eat less. And conversely, if you increase your physical activity, you increase your energy intake and you don't lose weight. If their brain homeostats are working appropriately, humans who exercise more do not lose weight. They simply eat more. And the problem is when you increase your energy intake, because something's gone wrong with the APPESTAT function, which then causes you to increase your energy intake, then there's no effect. You don't go and do more exercise. You become gluttonous and slothful, as he indicated. And so that's the key point to understand, that it's the APPESTAT is the regulator, and it has to fail first for obesity to develop. How it happened, how the failure happens, that's enough for another day. But the point is that just being less physically active will not cause you to become obese unless the APPESTAT fails. So here's Gary's slide again. And then the point is that 20 years later, the diabetes starts. And there's always a 20-year rule that was described by a South African in Durban, South Africa. He observed that when you took a population and you changed their diet, within 20 years the diabetes came about. And Iceland is a classic example because for generations you weren't eating grains. I looked outside, I didn't see any grains growing. I didn't see any bananas or apples growing. So the Icelandic people must have eaten lots of fish and other things. And you will be an insulin-resistant population for that reason, as I'll show you. And if you take that population and impose carbohydrates onto them, they will become fat much quicker than anyone else. The highest rates of obesity are in the Pacific Islands. Be people who ate coconut oil and fish for generations, hundreds of generations. And then suddenly the sugar and the flour comes and they become obese, morbidly obese very quickly. So that's the challenge for Iceland. You are very likely to become fatter as soon as you introduce carbohydrates. So I'm going to talk all about insulin resistance because what exactly is this condition of insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, from which I suffer and which I show is the most prevalent medical condition on planet Earth. And it's never taught at medical schools. I'll bet it's not taught here at your university. It's certainly not taught at my medical school. But which is included in the medical curriculum taught at few, if any, medical schools around the world. So the father of it is not Tim Noakes. It is Gerald Raven from Stanford, professor of medicine at Stanford. Got serious gravitas. And he's known as the father. He could easily epitomize as the father of insulin resistance. In addition to emphasizing the role of insulin resistance, compensatory hyperinsulinemia in increasing the likelihood of an individual developing one or more of the consequences, he first pointed out the clustering of these abnormalities, called it Syndrome X. It also became known as the metabolic syndrome. It's also known as Raven syndrome. And the two previous speakers have spoken about that. And just to remind you that Raven syndrome, he was the first to put them all together under one basket, in one basket. And these are the conditions, and I also will include other chronic diseases of lifestyle. These hypertension, visceral obesity, elevated blood triglyceride concentrations, low HDL cholesterol concentrations, and what Axel spoke about, the small LDL particles, pattern B, which are increased by a high carbohydrate diet but reduced by a high fat diet. And I will show you that actually the insulin resistance, the error he made was he didn't understand the insulin resistance wasn't the problem. And I'll explain that. And he will not get the Nobel Prize because he didn't understand it's not the insulin resistance, it's something else. But we'll come to that. So in the last few months, evidence has come out to show us exactly how we link carbohydrates to the metabolic syndrome to arterial disease. The linkage is now absolutely direct. That information has come out in the last few months. We now have definitive evidence that these abnormalities occur in people with insulin resistance who eat high carbohydrate diets and develop non-alcoholic fatty liver disease as a result. And it's the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease which was the real predictor of ill health. That you can be insulin resistant, be relatively healthy, but once you get non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, that's it. Your risk of disease goes up, and I'll explain why. So hence the macronutrient of interest in chronic disease is it's carbohydrate, not fat. They completely got it wrong. Ansel Keys got back the wrong horse completely, and I'll show you that why. But this truth comes through understanding human metabolism, not through understanding epidemiology. And I apologize that I'm going to have a few slides where we're going to look at human metabolism and the original data that Raven used and show you how it's absolutely proof that it's the carbohydrates in the diet that are killing us, not the fat. So if you go back to Raven's earliest study, I think this may not be the earliest, but it's certainly one of them, 1966. And he starts looking at high and low carbohydrate diets. And why? Because he was interested in the triglyceride response. I've no idea. I haven't fully researched enough. But he became interested not in cholesterol, but in triglycerides in the bloodstream. And he wanted to see what effect did high or low carbohydrate diets have on blood triglyceride concentrations, not cholesterol. And that was the key to why he was successful. And he discovered this: the majority of patients will increase their triglyceride production and concentration in the blood to a variable extent as a consequence of a high carbohydrate diet. So he links in 1966 the triglycerides in the bloodstream to the carbohydrate content of the diet. And the more abnormal the glucose tolerance curve, in other words, the more insulin resistant the people that he studied in this group, the higher the accompanying rises in plasma insulin, the greater the subsequent triglyceride rise on ingestion of a high carbohydrate diet. So now he's noticed that there's a link between insulin resistance, which he might not have called insulin resistance yet, and a high carbohydrate diet. And then he said hyperinsulinemia, excessive production of insulin, may be an important cause of the enhanced liver triglyceride production. Remember, Gary showed you that slide of how insulin drives fat into the cells to produce triglycerides. So he's looking at liver cells. So then he says endogenous hypertriglyceridemia, that's the internal production of triglyceride, is being driven by insulin. So the next article he does is the role of insulin in endogenous hypertriglyceridemia. I think it's a year later, 1967. And then this slide shows his data. Here is the blood triglyceride concentration. So he takes a population, measures their blood triglyceride concentration. He wants to explain why is it high, and he checks how much triglyceride is produced by the liver. And he shows that the rate of liver triglyceride secretion, it determines your blood triglyceride concentration. So we now know if you have a high triglyceride, it's because your liver is pumping out triglycerides. And why is that? And you could guess, the higher the insulin, the more the triglycerides in the bloodstream, and hence the higher the triglyceride production. So now he's been able to link triglycerides in the blood to liver production of triglycerides and to insulin. And so he said in most patients, the degree to which a high carbohydrate diet stimulates hepatic triglyceride secretion is directly related to the insulin response produced by that diet. In other words, the more carbohydrates, the more triglyceride production. And so then he develops the model over the next 40 years. And here's one of his most important papers, Insulin Resistance in Coronary Heart Disease in Non-Diabetic Individuals, where he develops his hypothesis and produces one very exciting diagram. And so what he says is that if you're insulin resistant, you're always over-secreting insulin, and that develops the metabolic syndrome, which leads to coronary heart disease. As Axel said, this is the strongest predictor of coronary heart disease. But also, you can get type 2 diabetes if your insulin fails or it's inadequate. You develop type 2 diabetes, which we also know is one of the best predictors of heart attack risk. So that's the model. But the key that he shows for the first time in any textbook of medicine is what happens when you've got too much insulin. Go and read your standard textbook of medicine. There's no story about what happens when you've got too much insulin. And this is what high insulin causes: weight gain, the atherogenic dyslipidemia, adiposity within the viscera, abnormality of function of the blood vessels, very important, hypertension, hyperuricemia, systemic inflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction, impaired exercise performance. But he's wrong. And the question is, why is he wrong? And he's wrong because that's not the problem. That's the problem. But that doesn't come from that. This comes from this. That's the problem. It's the high carbohydrate diet. And that's why he misses the Nobel Prize. Because what he should have done was to spend 30 years studying high carbohydrate diets in people with insulin resistance. But he didn't. He studied the syndrome. Fortunately, he did something. And I'll explain to you why he didn't study the high carbohydrate diets. And more recently, we know that one of the key facts about a high carbohydrate diet is you just make yourself more insulin resistant. So that every time you eat carbohydrates, you become slightly more insulin resistant. And that is why you've got this 20-year wait, because you have to eat enough carbohydrate for the diabetes to become apparent. So the problem for Gerald Raven was he understood that carbohydrates were involved. The basic defect in syndrome X, in metabolic syndrome, is resistance to insulin-mediated glucose disposal. If dietary carbohydrate is increased in an isocaloric diet, additional insulin must be secreted to maintain glucose homeostasis. And he showed you what the problems are with increased insulin. And so he developed the insulin nocentric model of chronic ill health. So Raven understands that carbohydrates drive insulin secretion in the metabolic syndrome or in insulin resistance. Hence, he had to conclude that restricting dietary carbohydrates should be the key therapy for this condition. That could be the only conclusion. And in 1987, he was heading towards that conclusion because he published 3 papers in, I think, 1987, 1989, and 1994, all showing the benefits of low carbohydrate diets in people with insulin resistance. So, for example, the statements, I won't go through all of them, but here he says, it seems prudent to avoid the use of low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets in patients with type 2 diabetes. So that statement is, avoid carbohydrates because they're hurting you if you've got insulin resistance. The results of this study indicate that high-carbohydrate diets lead to several changes in carbohydrate and lipid metabolism in patients with NIDDM that could lead to an increased risk of CAD. It seems reasonable to suggest that the routine recommendation of low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets for patients with NIDDM be reconsidered. Now, is that a glowing support for high-carbohydrate diets? No. And he continues this one. In type 2 diabetes, high-carbohydrate diets cause persistent deterioration of glycemic control, etc., etc., etc. So the question is, why did he stop in 1994 doing low-carbohydrate studies? And the answer is because he was at Stanford, which is one of the most progressive cardiovascular groups. Had he come out and said in 1994, you must all eat a high-fat diet, his career would have ended. Overnight, his career would have ended. And so wisely, he chose to continue researching without drawing attention to himself. And that's why that work is so fundamental, but it's got lost. So let's move on. So here's I think there, yeah, okay, so now, I was looking for another study, which I must have changed it. Okay, so this is the paper that came out about 3 months ago. And what it says is that non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in insulin resistance is the key driver of the atherogenic dyslipidemia, which we've shown is the small, dense LDL particles. And so I'm just going to read their conclusions. Patients with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease have severe insulin resistance, especially at the level of the adipose tissue when compared to patients without the condition. Those patients had significantly higher plasma apolipoprotein B to A1 ratios. And remember, Axel told us that it's the ApoB, which is the marker of atherogenic particles. Of note, these differences between patients were independent of the presence of obesity. Worse atherogenic dyslipidemia was best predicted by the degree of liver fat accumulation in adipose tissue and systemic insulin resistance. So what they are showing for the first time is that the key driver of the atherogenic dyslipidemia is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And how do you get non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? You get it from eating a high carbohydrate diet in people who are insulin resistant. And so they continue in the same vein. Conclusion, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease was associated with a worse atherogenic lipoprotein profile regardless of the level of obesity. We speculate that this lipoprotein profile is driven mostly by liver fat content and by insulin resistance. It's not worsened by obesity. So this explains why some people with obesity are not at such great risk. It's the insulin resistance and the NAFLD that causes it. So taken together, worsening insulin-resistant and atherogenic dyslipidemia may be key mechanisms explaining the increased cardiovascular risk observed in these patients. In summary, we have demonstrated that liver fat accumulation in the setting of insulin resistance is, I draw attention to it, the main factor associated with worsening atherogenic dyslipidemia. And the key point is what gives you liver fat? It's a high carbohydrate diet. It's not the saturated fat in your diet. So this finally gives us the solution to the problem and explains why it is the high carbohydrate diet that is killing all of us. And so So the future understanding of how atherogenic dyslipidemia arises will come from the work of liver experts who understand insulin resistance and high carbohydrate diets, not from cardiologists. To protect your heart and arteries, I suggest you consult a hepatologist. So now this brings me to the punchline of the talk. And that is, we can now explain why medicine is completely failing us. And I say that as a doctor. And the problem in medicine is we see what is above the surface and we think that's the whole story, and we ignore what's under the surface. And so what we see above the surface is we see arterial disease. And notice I've called it arterial disease because there are different forms of arterial disease, as Axel said. There's the disseminated type, which is type 2 diabetes. And that's why I put type 2 diabetes under arterial disease, because it's the major contributor to arterial disease. And then you get cardiovascular or cerebrovascular disease. Then you get obesity, you get hypertension, gout, and the atherogenic dyslipidemia with a focus on hyperinsulinemia, high triglycerides. Why high triglycerides? Because you've got a fatty liver pumping them out. Why low HDL? Because the fatty liver, for some reason, reduces its HDL production, and increased small numbers of LDL particles. And that is what you want to know if you want to judge whether you've got atherogenic dyslipidemia. It's not cholesterol, as Axel indicated. It's these things that you want. Now, the point of the slide is the following. These are not separate diseases. They're all the same disease. And they're not even diseases. They are an abnormal response, abnormal physiological response to an abnormal input. And that's the key. And it occurs in people with insulin resistance. And this is the disease. That's the condition. So when I tell patients, I don't tell them you have hypertension. I say you've got insulin resistance, which is fantastic because we can solve the problem. So each of us sits somewhere on this curve. Every single person living in Iceland sits somewhere on this curve. And if you all treat them the same, if you treat all of them the same, you're going to get it wrong for most of them. You're either highly carbohydrate tolerant, or you're normal, or you're like me, profoundly intolerant. And if you're tolerant, you're probably an athlete and you're probably normal body weight, and you probably will never get these diseases. You can eat pretty much what you like. But if you're to the left with me, there's only one way you can go, and that is expanding waistline, obesity, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes. That's it. There is no other way. And that's the point. When we're talking about nutrition, it's not the nutrition the issue, it's who's the patient. And you've got to fit the diet to the patient. And people just don't seem to get it. That if you're insulin resistant, you cannot eat carbohydrates. Full stop. So I eat 25 grams of carbohydrate a day maximum, and I cannot eat 26 or 27 or 28. And that's the key. People have to understand that we're dealing with margins, tiny, tiny margins. And if you have type 2 diabetes and you want to eat 100 grams of carbohydrate a day, you do it, but you're just going to kill yourself earlier. Your only hope is to get to 25 grams or less. And I think in time we'll find cancer and dementia also carbohydrate-dependent diseases. So briefly, very briefly, what happens in insulin resistance? This is, obviously a very simple explanation. But I believe it's a genetic predisposition. I believe we're all born with a certain degree of insulin resistance, and we either accelerate it or we don't accelerate it so much. The youngest child ever to be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes was 3 years old. Now that person was born with high insulin resistance, and the insulin resistance just ramped up like that. Whereas for myself, my ramping was like that. It took me 20 or 30 years to develop the type 2 diabetes. And so that's the big difference. So you're born with a genetic predisposition, and it just gets worse. And the more carbohydrates you eat, the quicker you're going to get your type 2 diabetes. But the primary abnormality is a liver that just pumps out glucose. And that's really important to understand, because if you're dealing with metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes, these people have already got a liver that's pumping out glucose all the time in excess. Why would you want to give them more carbohydrate? It doesn't make sense. So that's the primary abnormality. The primary abnormality is not that the muscles can't take up glucose. That is an issue, but it's not the key problem. The key problem is a liver that is uncontrolled in the way it produces glucose. Then we can't store that carbohydrate, and that's important because if you've got athletes who are insulin resistant and you're telling them to eat lots of carbohydrate, they're not going to store it in the muscles, they're going to store it as liver fat. And that's not going to help. Then we always got these hyperinsulinemic response to ingested carbohydrate. And then this is the key. Increased conversion of excess ingested carbohydrate goes to fat in the liver under the action of insulin. That causes NAFLD, which causes increased blood triglycerides to be stored as fat in the adipose tissue. But the NAFLD then produces this atherogenic dyslipidemia. And that's the reduced production of the good HDL and an excessive production of the small, dense LDL particles. And that's a very simple explanation. But each of the mechanisms are documented, and it explains it. So now, if you understand that, why would you ever want anyone to give people carbohydrate unless you know whether they're carbohydrate tolerant or carbohydrate resistant? It's malpractice to give people who are insulin resistant high carbohydrate diets. If you don't test them and you don't know their insulin tolerance, you may not prescribe carbohydrates for them. That's how I see it. And if you are prescribing carbohydrates for insulin resistant people, that's malpractice. And we've got to get that message out. So here are some friends from New Zealand, and here's basically saying essentially what I'm saying. And these are some of the conditions they've linked to hyperinsulinemia. I didn't link all of them, but here are some more. And what's the prevalence of hyperinsulinemia? I think it's highly prevalent. California announced about 2 months ago that 50% of Californians have insulin resistance because they have type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes, and that means they haven't even checked for the other population, the group that hasn't yet developed type 2 diabetes. So a minimum of 50% of Californians are insulin resistant. Given its association with metabolic syndrome and fatty liver, this warrants investigation. Could early detection and careful management of hyperinsulinemia decrease the need for medical interventions later in life? And the answer is yes. It doesn't take a genius to work that one out. Would managing hyperinsulinemia improve both quality and quantity of life? And this is the picture they provide with that article. So these are all the diseases, and those are the diseases that are clogging up the hospitals in Iceland, as they are clogging up the hospitals in every city around the world. And guess what? Most of them, maybe all of them, you can explain as insulin resistance and high carbohydrate diets. And if that is true, then we've got a revolutionary solution for our current medical problems. And I spoke to one of the politicians here today, and he said, you guys have got to give us a standard message. I said, you're not going to get this message from anyone but a few of us who are independent of the industry. Because if you're dependent on the industry, there's no way you're going to... How many industries function because of these diseases? Just ask that question. Utterly dependent on these diseases. Are they going to cut off everything by saying, let's just stop eating carbohydrates and then we can close up the pharmaceutical industry? Okay, you get the point. So,
you overfeed somebody with fat, you don't increase their cancer risk at all.
I'm sorry, can we maybe try it again with a bit more sound?
You overfeed somebody with carbohydrates.
Yeah, here we go.
If you overfeed somebody with fat, you don't increase their cancer risk at all. Okay? You overfeed somebody with carbohydrates and you dramatically increase their cancer rate. And protein is halfway in between. And that's why we're going to have a huge debate about these carbohydrate-based diets.
So that is the voice of Craig Thompson, who's the CEO of the Sloan Kettering Cancer. And you heard what he said. It wasn't Tim Noakes telling you carbohydrates are associated to cancer. And because we've been told that fat causes cancer, and he said the opposite. It's carbohydrate-based diets. And it's really interesting because he believes the diet heart hypothesis. So he sees a problem. He says, okay, we'll save cancer by telling people to eat a high-fat diet, but we'll cause heart disease. So it's not because he is anti-fat or anti-carbohydrate that he said that. He's a person who believes that you should be eating carbohydrates to prevent heart disease. Yet he can say that cancer is a carbohydrate-driven disease. And that's, again, an important point. So this is the final slide. What does all this mean? Hypertension, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, etc. are the symptoms. They're symptoms of the underlying physiological abnormality. They're not the disease. And we are treating those diseases with pharmaceutical drugs which cannot address the cause. And so they must fail. And ultimately, that truth has to become apparent, that we have to get to the cause. The common pathology in all these conditions is insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is a benign condition. That is why populations that were insulin resistant were fine. They didn't have all these diseases until the carbohydrates came in. A high carbohydrate diet turns insulin resistance into a killer. I do want to make a point that there are other issues in our lifestyle, but that are killing us. Of course, smoking and blah, 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 and not exercising, etc. But in my opinion, it's the insulin resistance and the high carbohydrate diets that are the cornerstones. A low carbohydrate diet is the key to the prevention and treatment of insulin resistance and hence all these conditions. And the good news is that there are some of these conditions which we might be able to reverse. For example, some cases of type 2 diabetes will reverse. By that I mean they become asymptomatic, they don't require insulin any further on a low carbohydrate diet. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope it means something to you what I've said.